There has been great contention over the Supreme Court's recent decision to take up President Trump's immunity claim, the idea that President Trump committed actions that conformed to his official conduct as president, and therefore he should not be indicted for them. The reactions to the Supreme Court's decision have been almost universally negative, at least on the left side of the political aisle. And perhaps the most potent and even, I hate to say this, but the most compelling of all these reactions in terms of scope and also in terms of what really captures the main argument being made against the Supreme Court doing this, comes directly from MSNBC and their prominent personality, Rachael Maddow. So Maddow said two things about this particular incident that I want to go over, but then I'm going to explain the broader significance of this whole thing. And I want to address some of the left-wing conspiracy theories that have become so persistent due to the fact that the Supreme Court is essentially allowing the process of due process to be fulfilled as was envisioned by our founders and not simply sweeping it under the rug to benefit the political ambitions of the left wing. Anyway, let us actually look at what Maddow had to say about this. First, the first comment she made that was particularly interesting was that the Supreme Court taking up this particular issue was bullpucky because there's no clear basis for them to do so. Go.
Is really presidential immunity an open question? Because what's the most famous pardon in American history? Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon once he had resigned and was a former president. Why did Gerald Ford pardon Richard Nixon? Quote, as a result of certain acts or omissions occurring before his resignation as president, meaning as a result of stuff he did while president, quote, Richard Nixon has become liable to possible indictment and trial. Right. Whether or not he shall be so prosecuted depends on findings of the appropriate grand jury and the discretion of the authorized prosecutor. So the idea that this is an open question, that it might be that a former president can never be tried for something that he did because he was president when he did it, is disproven by a plain reading of American history and the whole justification for Richard Nixon being pardoned in the first place. So the idea that this has to be taken up is them saying the sky is green.
Right.
And I think even for the non-lawyers among us to be able to say, you know what, the sky is not green even on our worst day, this is BS. You are doing this as a dilatory tactic to help your political friend, your partisan patron. And for you to say that this is something that the court needs to decide because it's something that's unclear in the law is just flagrant bullpucky. And they know it, and they don't care that we know it, and that's disturbing about the future legitimacy of the court.
Well, okay, there is a factual thing there. It is true that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, but what is not true, and what Maddow failed to inform her viewers of, is the fact that because Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, there was no precedent established about this particular issue. Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon was a preemptive action that happened before, obviously, any real charges or any real investigation happened. The Supreme Court was not brought in to actually deal with the matter at hand. And so what happens when something occurs in American history that does not involve the court, but that may have potential as a legal issue and perhaps potential as precedent in the future, you can bring it up when it becomes relevant once again. This is how the Republican system of law works. This is how classical Republicanism checks and balances are supposed to work. And Maddow knows that. She's not an idiot. But she is deliberately being obtuse. She is deliberately being limited in what she is saying, selective in what she is saying, to misinform the masses of this case, and by doing so, make the case for her own political agenda. Now let's go to the second part here, where she basically says that Trump is going to use this as an attempt to stay in office for life. This is perhaps one of the more nuttier claims that I've heard recently. Go.
Now, if you think about the court as the Supreme Court of the United States and a rational actor and a decent one, that was a reasonable supposition, and it just turns out they're not that. Incremental bit of progress here. The important question here is not whether the Supreme Court is going to decide that Donald Trump and all presidents are immune from prosecution for crimes they committed while they were president. I mean, it would be fully insane for them to actually side with Trump here, right? The conclusion that we can arrive at now based on what they have done without having to wait for the ruling is that they are ensuring that Trump will not face trial. And when they inevitably rule that presidents aren't immune from prosecution after they leave office, what that will tell Donald Trump, if by then he is president, is that he can never leave the office of the presidency.
Right.
And if he is voted out in 2028, he cannot leave office, and he is willing to he is welcome to commit any crimes he wants to, as long as he is still president, in order to ignore the result of that election and stay in power for life, because otherwise he is going to go to prison when he gets out.
All right, so obviously there's no basis for this, but most importantly than that, it follows in the trend of flagrant, irrational conspiracism undertaken by Maddow and her friends over the past few years. You guys may remember that Maddow was actually the chief articulator, the chief apologist for the Russia collusion hoax. She was on TV almost every single night telling her viewers that they were getting close to indicting Trump and they were getting close to finding evidence of him actually being involved with Russia in an illicit way. She kept this narrative going for so long. And ultimately, it all turned out not to be true. And instead of actually apologizing to her viewers and surrendering herself to the altar of veracity, the altar of truth, Maddow instead has doubled down and she has found new conspiracy theories to go out. So this is not about Maddow, though. And the mistake that so many of us on the right make is that we're obsessed with personalities and we talk more about people than we do ideas. Small minds talk about people. Great minds talk about ideas. So let's actually think about the ideas here, because Maddow is simply a vessel, an emissary for a certain phenomenon that is occurring in our society that is quite troubling, and that all of us as Americans and as people who are pure-hearted and love the truth should be concerned about and should act to correct. The broader significance of what is happening to President Trump is the issue not of presidential immunity, that is the substance, but the issue that the presidential immunity is wrapped up in is that of due process. In a system of classical republicanism, you have a set of checks and balances because the idea is that the government is supposed to balance itself up by internal principles checking each other so that no one branch is too powerful. Right now, the executive branch happens to be the branch that is prosecuting President Trump, the executive branch of the government, and of course the executives of different states, different localities, like Jack Smith, for example. And so the executive branch obviously wants the trial to happen before the election so that they could possibly provoke a result favorable towards them and their own political ideology, which obviously is leftism, ahead of the election. And if you actually look at the political context surrounding the fact that half of Americans have told surveys that they will not vote for President Trump if he is convicted of a crime, there is even more political incentive to actually do this kind of thing. What am I saying? What I'm saying is this. The defendant of a particular case in America has the right to a speedy trial, to a fair trial, to a speedy and fair trial. It is unfair to rush a issue that is a rather novel legal issue, that is uncharted territory, that is happening in the middle of election season and actually has a lot of moving parts to it, to expedite it, all to achieve what is most likely a political aim, a political goal, and not a legal goal, and not a philosophical goal. The legal system is meant, the end of the legal system is to preserve justice. But if I can demonstrate to you that justice is being railroaded by the omission of due process for a political goal, then the legal system in that context is no longer preserving justice. They are preserving their own self-interest, which is a perversion of the legal process. This has been happening for a very long time. That's exactly what we're seeing here. Due process is necessary, not just for a government to run well and to respect its citizens. It's necessary for a culture that prides itself on having a sense of inalienable rights amongst people. And it's also necessary for a healthy political order where persecution of your political opponents is not an option that you use for political engagement, but rather discussion and advocacy in the public sphere is instead that option. And so we have to understand something as well. Maddow and everyone in her camp who seek to have this trial sped through. Because the fundamental argument here is not about principles. It's not about the soundness of the question that the court is considering. It is entirely and utterly about being able to get Donald Trump before the clock runs out, which is why Maddow was saying he'll stay in office forever. The fundamental issue here is that these people claim to stand for democracy, and yet they wish to deny one of the most basic rites of passage in a so-called democracy that there is, and that is the principle of popular sovereignty, popular consent, that the people are empowered to make the political decisions that guide their future and constitute the constitution of a particular government in terms of the personnel that are within that government. It would seem to me fundamentally anti-democratic to be urging for due process to be railroaded so that people can no longer have that choice by taking a candidate that you do not like off the ballot and out of consideration. But actually, and here's going to be the more interesting part of this video for many of you. Many of you that use that argument I just used are missing the point. I actually intentionally did that. It actually is a facet of democracy and the philosophy of democracy to want to use these kind of weaponized tactics against your political opponents. The illusion that so many people have that democracy is the system that empowers the people to make decisions that best fit their own lives is an absolute lie. It's a lie for many reasons, but first we'll start with this. Democracy is simply an abstract term that has very little working in reality, that has very little concreteness to it, that can be used to justify evil because democracy is fundamentally of an emotional nature, of an emotional order, because our culture has been propagandized into believing that democracy is the most virtuous form of government. Even if you look at throughout history, that's obviously not the case. So you have to understand, when someone says that this is for democracy, most of the time they're referring to nothing tangible, and they are instead trying to emotionally manipulate you. And in the case where they're not trying to emotionally manipulate you, they're trying to intellectually manipulate you because they want you to presume that democracy is the best thing since sliced bread without actually investigating or questioning that presumption. And if you accept a presumption without actually questioning the presumption, you are little more than an intellectual slave. You're little more than simply someone that receives ideas rather than someone that deals with ideas. A ballast, not a thinker, but you're a human being. And as a human being, you are a thinker. As an American, you inherit a tradition of thinkers. As an American, you inherit a culture that can only be sustained. A culture of freedom, a culture of rationality, a culture of individualism, a culture of cooperation that can only be sustained if man uses his higher capacity to think. But the moment you don't do that because there's some kind of cultural norm you want to believe, there's some kind of mythology you've been sold, there's some kind of idea that you've not questioned but that feels good to you and locks your spirit up into this place of contentment, the moment you refuse to think is the moment you don't only refuse to be an American, it's the moment you refuse to actually use your full human capacity to its extent, and that, by consequence, is the moment that you actually stop fully being a human being. Rest on that for a second. But the truth is, let's go back to how the power structure uses democracy as a term of control. The truth is, democracy is a persistent myth and an incoherent political idea that is anathema to America's moral ethos, and that calling foul when an election is not decided by judicial fiat, but instead decided by the people, under this idea of democracy, that actually is allowed. How so? Because progressivism, let's do two things here. Progressivism understands democracy, or understands political order rather, by trying to impose centralized control upon the people to create a world that they want through force. And they wish to do this not only through policy, which they have done by the way of the administrative state, because that was entirely a progressive idea coming out of the 1900s, but they wish to do this also by turning the terms of engagement in American politics. There's a reason why activist groups like Antifa use violence or riots as a means of political engagement, and left-wing minds justify riots on the basis of them being the voice of the unheard. It's not because they're being stupid, it's because under their political worldview, you can only change society, you can only make policy if it is done by force, and if the terms of engagement in a society empower the use of force and violence amongst the members of society in order to get them to do a thing you want them to do. It is enmity by design. It is conflict by design. Conflict for political and philosophical ends. That's what it is. This has been the entire philosophy of the left since the 1960s. Since Marcuse and Foucault and all of them. But I go on. Progressivism's ethos that society must be managed by a centralized authority for it to work properly has been the calling card of this movement for a very long while. Democracy works in the way that Maddow wants it to work in terms of reducing the amount of candidates on the ballot so that the centralized class can pick who they want, because democracy is simply an arm of the centralized order, because the masses, a majority of the masses, are easily swayed by their emotions and by propagandists, and their consent, that by which they use to vote, becomes manufactured and controlled by the centralized political power class. Democracy, especially in our current context, where it empowers the masses, actually does not empower the masses. It empowers those in power in the oligarchy who can use the media and use cultural mores and norms that are conceived under mediocre ideas to manipulate the masses towards their own ends. So in that sense, this is all about democracy. Because the centralized ruling class wants Trump out, and they want Americans to have no real choice whatsoever. So in all honesty, this is about democracy, because democracy is simply an arm of those that are in power. Because those that are in power can manipulate your mind for you to believe something. How in the world can you truly consent to anything? This is why Maddow and MSNBC are actually particularly offensive to the American people. They are counting on the masses not to think, not to do anything else but sit there and listen to them, not to research American constitutional philosophy, and not to actually understand the issues at hand here so that their agenda can succeed. But in the absence of such ignorance, it becomes incredibly hard to convince people to be serfs under an enlightened despot or an enlightened administrative class that can run their lives and manage their lives better than they can, supposedly. That is the rub here. It's about using ignorance of the Constitution, using ignorance of philosophy, using ignorance of Americanism, and using ignorance of sound governance to dupe the masses into believing what you want them to believe. And if we look at how majorities throughout the West have acted in the past 50, 60, 70 years, look at how majorities throughout the West have been accompanied to all kinds of rights violations, accompanied to all kinds of evil, accompanied to all kinds of destruction around the globe, whether it be in the war on terror, whether it be in so many other things, then we can easily see just what democracy, TM, really means. When you use an incoherent idea to drive forth policy, you will get results that are also incoherent, or results that in their incoherency can be made coherent, but to an aim that they were not initially conceived to do. That is what it is. But when you use sound principles and first principles to constrain the limits of your policy making and your politics, it is incredibly hard, if not damn near impossible, to manipulate and lie, because your words and your initiatives can be tested against the solid foundation of what actually is true, and that can be confirmed by reason, and that can be refined through philosophy. The truth is this, my friends. The goal is to manipulate, the goal is to distort, and the goal is to use your emotions against you. We need a revolution of the mind in this country. Do not let them do this. Be smart about this. Study your constitutional history and realize this is not about Donald Trump. This is about attempting to, by fiat, remove a candidate from the ballot and deprive the American people of a choice that our Republican form of government guarantees that we should have. And by God, if we want to have a country, we should maintain that norm. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe to this video. Be sure also to donate to me on PayPal, Patreon, all that good stuff down in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive and don't watch MSNBC. Bye, guys.